The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight, follow-up investigations. New information in a series we call What Happened Next? First up, in 2008, we told you the story of India's untouchables, now called Dalit women, living a life of hardship.
Dalit women sit at the bottom of the class hierarchy, the gender hierarchy, and the caste hierarchy. And all those forms of subjugation come together and get compounded.
Now, one of the Dalits we met has come to America to become a symbol of hope for her people.
I'm very fortunate because I got this opportunity to come here so I can help my people.
Also, earlier this year, we brought you the story of the deadly consequences of forced marriage in the United Kingdom.
There is something fundamentally wrong here in Britain, where in 21st century Britain, we are still dealing with the barbaric practice of forced marriage. You know, we're not talking about some third world country out there. This is England.
Tonight, we examine whether forced marriage is an issue for our large immigrant population in the U.S.
If there's one thing that we're learning through the work that we're doing is that it is a huge problem that people don't want to talk about, but is severe and limits the life of women and girls throughout the United States.
Digging deeper into our original investigations, our reporting never stops. We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports. Good evening. Tonight, seeking social justice for women. We begin in India, a country that prides itself on being the world's largest democracy. But as our investigation found, the country has a hidden side, a side seldom if ever seen by tourists who flock to what's being heralded as one of the world's next great superpowers. Because in the shadows of this prosperity, 167 million people, the equivalent of half the population of the United States, are routinely being raped, abused, even murdered. This is a country where wealth and poverty live side by side, and a centuries-old social hierarchy conflicts with a modern democracy. At the very bottom of this society, there is a class of people, more than 10% of the population, who live a life that seems inconceivable in the 21st century. They are called the Dalits, and they know only one side of India. They used to be called untouchables, but that's now considered derogatory. While their name has changed, their lot in life has not. They are denied a full education. They are routinely physically and sexually abused. And they work the dirtiest and most menial jobs, jobs no one else will do. And Dalit women, being the lowest of the low, have it worst of all. Vinkatama earns less than $1 a day cleaning up trash and human feces with her bare hands. The job is called manual scavenging.
Dalit women sit at the bottom of the class hierarchy, the gender hierarchy, and the caste hierarchy. And all those forms of subjugation come together and get compounded.
The Dalits don't have many champions, especially in the Western world. But there is one woman of Indian descent who is working tirelessly to change that. Smita Narula runs the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the New York University School of Law. She travels to India regularly and a decade ago wrote the book broken people.
You prefer not to use the word untouchables.
It's a pejorative term and implies with it a lower or inferior status to the person that's named an untouchable. It's important not to use the term untouchable, but it's important also to recognize that even if we don't use the term, that untouchability, the practice of untouchability, is alive and well in India today.
Narula says that in order to understand the degradation Dalits face, you can start with the job of manual scavenging.
They are not given masks. They are not given gloves. They're basically given a tin pan and a broom to do the job, and they're forced to do it. Nobody else will give them other jobs to do.
అంటే అందరూ పాస్ వాళ్ళకి పోతారు ఇళ్ళల్లో పని చేసుకుంటారు ఇళ్ళకి వస్తారు దీనికి ఎట్టా డోకు రాదా ఊళ్ళు తిరగదా.
There are an estimated 1 million manual scavengers working in villages with primitive plumbing, if any. The Indian government outlawed this degrading job, at least officially.
Ironically, the same government that outlaws manual scavenging is also the same government that hires the most manual scavengers in the country.
Well, how can that be?
How can it be? That's just the paradox in which India operates. There are so many differences between the rule of law and the rule of caste and the rule of society. And these kinds of paradoxes are just part and parcel of the system.
The discrimination is both obvious and subtle, infecting all aspects of society. Take a look at this. On this rural bus trip, in a scene reminiscent of Jim Crow laws, Eswaya rises to give up his seat. He is a clerical worker from southeast India and a Dalit. He says this kind of behavior is expected.
ఒకవేళ సీట్లు ఉన్నా కూడా సీట్లు లేకున్నా కూడా లేరు ఖాళీగా సీట్లు లేవు మేము ఎక్కున్నాము వాళ్ళే మా వాళ్ళు పైన ఎక్కుంటారు సరే సీట్లు ఉన్నాయి మేము కూర్చున్నాము ఊళ్ళో పోతే సీట్లు లేవు ఎక్కడికి పుల్లు అయిపోయినాయి సీట్లు ఆడకు పోయినప్పుడు ఏం చేస్తారమ్మా సరే ఆయన మన రెడ్డి వచ్చాడు మన రెడ్డి అమ్మ వచ్చింది అని చెప్పి మేమే వాళ్ళ సీట్లు లేదు ఎందుకంటే ఒకవేళ ఈ లేదు అనుకమ్మా.
Eswaya took the bus to a tea shop in a neighboring village. He wanted to show us another subtle form of discrimination. When he orders tea, he gets a special glass cup, while the higher quality stainless steel ones are saved for higher caste customers. It is discrimination like this and jobs like manual scavenging that keep Dalits firmly in place at the lowest rung of society.
Many Americans' view of modern India, the India of today, is an India on the move, economically, culturally, but perhaps particularly economically.
India has aggressively embraced the liberalization theory of economic management and the trickle-down theory of economic growth. But for majority of Dalits in the country, the fruits of that growth cannot permeate the caste ceiling. You know, India is many countries in one, even within the same village or street or city. It is true that India is a booming economic powerhouse. It is also true that even as it climbs economically more powerful, that more and more people are being left out of that economic growth.
For over 3,000 years, India's rigid caste system created a brutal social order. The system was abolished, at least on paper, by the 1950 Constitution that gave birth to modern India. But caste often still determines a person's job, education level, and whom they marry. Beneath even the lowest caste, outside the caste system, are the Dalits.
But it occurs to me to ask, how do you tell who's a Dalit?
One's last name is often a caste name and gives one's caste away. Where one lives will automatically give away one's caste status. Often the way one dresses, maybe even the way that one communicates might give it away. They might use language that's more deferential, but the single most telling attribute is one's name.
Here, Dalits pump water from their own well. Indian law says anyone is permitted to pump water from public wells. But upper castes frequently forbid Dalits from public wells because they argue that the mere presence of Dalits will pollute the water supply. And Dalit children are often segregated and made to sit in the back of the classroom by upper caste teachers. A United Nations investigator reported that some Indian teachers said Dalit pupils cannot learn unless they are beaten. And this abuse extends to the very people who are charged with protecting the Dalits, the police. According to India's own Human Rights Commission, the police themselves are the biggest violators of Dalit rights. Rape and abuse by police officers are widespread.
Many police stations don't even allow Dalits to enter. So already that's a barrier to
You mean you can't
justice.
even go in the police station?
And then there are instances that I have documented and investigated in which when Dalits do get to enter the police station, the crime is not registered, or worse, they twice become the victims of abuse because then the police abuse them through torture, or if it's women, through rape. This is why the rule of law in India lives in the shadow of the rules of caste.
Throughout India, there is another harrowing exploitation of Dalit women that is so woven into the social fabric that it's accepted with little outrage. We travel to a small village in southeast India where the oppression is as heavy as the humidity. At festivals like this one, in the name of Hindu culture and ritual, the life of a Dalit girl can change in an instant. It starts like this. A girl put in a trance by local religious leaders is said to embody the spirit of the village deity. Sometimes she will select a Dalit girl to ceremoniously marry that deity, and what follows is a lifetime of horror. The chosen girl will not be able to marry anyone else. She will become a matama, a sex slave, committed to her community for the rest of her life. And even worse, Dalit parents sometimes offer their own girls up as matamas as a kind of sacrifice to the village god. That's what happened with Nagarama.
అనిపిస్తుంది మేడం ఏం చేద్దాం ఇంకా అదే పెద్దోళ్ళు ఎట్టు చేశారు ఇంకా భర్త అంటే ఇంక పెళ్లి చేసుకోవడానికి అట్టు వీలు కదా మేడం కష్టం చేసి పెంచాలి తప్పదు మేడం అది.
She's 26 years old, has 3 children, and no hope for her future. She's bound to a tradition that lets men of any caste, high or low, have sex with her whenever they please. Sometimes the men pay her, but her income is meager. Though matamas may be untouchable by day, they are anything but at night.
తప్పించుకోవచ్చు మేడం కొంతమంది దగ్గర ఏదో ఏది బాగాలేదని సర్టైట్ చెప్పేసి మన పట్టుకుని వదులుతారు ఒక్కొక్కరు వదలరు మేడం అంట.
So here's the ritualization of this practice. She is married to a kind of a religious institution that then makes her available sexually for upper caste men who rape her and rape her as part of as a cultural practice and seeing it as bringing good blessings to do so.
So would you describe this as prostitution?
I would describe it as forced prostitution, yes.
So these women then are available, so to speak, to members of the temple, high-ranking members of the temple?
Including members of the temple, but also upper caste men in the area, including married men.
Well, if you were a married man, you wouldn't want to have anything to do with the Dalit, so-called untouchable, would you?
It's ironic, isn't it?
Once the matamas are chosen, they must travel to the surrounding villages and perform dances like this one for the men. The men then select the women they want to sleep with. Sometimes the matamas are away from home for days at a time, having sex with various men.
అదే ఒంట్లో బాగాలేకుండా అట్టు ఉంటాం కదా మనం బయటికి పోతే ఎవరైనా మనల్ని ఇది అవుతారు మేడం ఇంట్లోకి వచ్చి మనం చూసేవాళ్ళు ఎవరు ఉంటారు కదా మేడం ఇంకా జీవితాంతకాలం ఉండిపోవాల్సిందే మేడం ఇంకా మాతమ్మ ఉన్న తర్వాత మాతమ్మగానే ఉండిపోవాలి కొద్ది రోజులు అట్ట ఇట్ట మారి పెళ్లి చేసుకుని అట్ట ఇట్ట పోయేదానికి అదంతా వీలు కదా మేడం బాధగా ఉంటుంది అదే మనకి ఏం లేకపోయినా మనం తక్కువ కులంలో పుట్టాము ఇట్ట అయిపోయాము.
Nagarama says she knows it's too late for her. Her life's fate is already determined. But another young matama still holds out hope she can change her fate. Vera Lakshmi is just 16 years old. But she fears her dreams will be crushed when she turns 18. That is when, she told us, men in her village will approach her for sex. Originally, her older sister was a Mahatma, but she fled, and that was when Vera Lakshmi's fate was sealed.
ఈ విధంగా తను వెళ్ళిపోయి మళ్ళీ నన్ను కూడా ఈ విధంగా చేసి నా జీవితం అంటూ నాశనం చేయదలిచినప్పుడు నాకు సంతోషం, నాకు కోరికలన్నీ ఉంటాయని చెప్పి ఈ విధంగా చేసుకోవాలనే ఉద్దేశంతో నాకు కొద్దిగా బాధగానే ఉంది.
Vera Lakshmi's mother became ill shortly after the older sister ran away. Villagers said the illness was a punishment from the local goddess. To appease the angry deity, Vera Lakshmi's mother offered her remaining daughter up as a Mahatma.
ఏమైనా జరుగుతుందేమో అని అంటే ఇంకా ఆ తల్లి ఇష్టం, ఆమె ఏ విధంగా పెట్టుంటుందో మనకు తెలియదు కదా. దేవతలు అంటూ అంటే వాళ్ళ చేతుల్లో ఉన్నది, ఈ విధంగా ఈ కుటుంబాన్ని బాగుపరచాలనేది వాళ్ళ ఇష్టం. నేను చదివిన తర్వాత ఇంజనీరింగ్ అవ్వాలనుకుంటున్నాను. చదివి ఇంజనీరింగ్ అయ్యి నా సాయశక్తులు ఏదో నాకు తోచింది ఈ ఊరికి బాగు చేయడం, నేను సాయం చేయడం, ఈ విధంగా మూఢాచారాలు నమ్మకుండా మన సాయశక్తులు మనం పోరాడి మనం చేసుకోవాలని.
Vera Lakshmi is one young woman in one village signaling a faint hope for the future. But outside her village, thousands of other Dalits are proving that, against all odds, overcoming the obstacles of being born Dalit is possible. Dalit activist Nitin Salve is a Dalit himself. He was able to get a college education because of the Indian government's affirmative action program, and he says one of his missions is to inject self-confidence into the Dalit people.
60 years of affirmative action in India has helped Dalit community very much, and you can see them in various public offices. You can see their standard of living raised a little bit.
Nitin says that about a quarter of slots in public colleges and government jobs are now reserved for Dalits, and he has tried to encourage Dalits in the private sector as well. These are the offices for Temp Solutions, a temp agency that finds jobs for Dalits like Pratibha Campbell. She has taken advantage of educational opportunities to try to improve her life, and we traveled with her to her hometown to see how far she has come. The girls here are not subjected to the horrors of the Mahatma system, but their opportunities are still limited.
And this is the very poor slums. That's you call slums area. In this area, mostly educated 8th, 10th class, not upper that.
But Pratibha is the shining exception. She has an education. She talked her way out of an arranged marriage and put herself through college instead.
My age, all girls are married. I am one of the girls. I am not married. And I educated postgraduate. And this is my biggest achievement.
She's earned a master's degree in social work. Now she's working with Nitin to find a job in a place she never dreamed possible, the United States. All part of a special program to bring Dalit college graduates to the U.S. to expand their horizons.
This is a very surprise thing for me and my families, because my all relatives not getting very educated. So this is good opportunity for me and my families. I went US. This is a dreams for whole families, my whole families.
Pratibha hopes that if she makes it to the U.S., she will set an example for her younger sister and the other Dalit girls in her village. Professor Smita Narula says while affirmative action is making a difference for some Dalits, most Dalits continue to struggle.
It cannot be refuted that the majority of Dalits in India today continue to be treated as untouchables. That fact in and of itself, whether it was happening to 10 people, 10 million people, or in this case 167 million people, should be enough for people to sit up and take notice and support Dalits and other Indians within India who are working very hard to eradicate the system and to do something about it. I think that the more engagement and the more eyes that are open, the better.
And eyes are slowly beginning to open. In 2006, India's Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, made a landmark speech comparing untouchability to apartheid in South Africa. But Professor Narula says real change will be slow.
There is a very strong process of dehumanization that has to take place in the mind of a society, of a people, against another group of people, to cease to see them as individuals, as human beings. And that kind of dehumanization, that kind of second-class citizen status, has been going on for thousands of years. It's going to take a lot to change that system. And a constitution that came around only 58 years ago isn't going to overnight do the trick.
Since our report, Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh called for an end to the dirty and demeaning job of manual scavenging by the end of this year, decrying the practice as one of the, quote, darkest blots on India. But political pronouncements can only go so far. When we return, we'll tell you the story of how one of the Dalits we met in India has come to America. That's coming up next. Welcome back. As we've seen tonight, the plight of Dalit women in India casts a shadow on that country's image as a rising modern nation. And we saw how change is coming, often one person at a time. So when we heard that one of the Dalit women we profiled years ago was now living and working in the United States, we were eager to see how her life had changed and what it all meant for the community she had left back home. We first met Pratibha Gamble 4 years ago in her village in western India. She was studying English, having just earned a coveted spot in a special jobs program that attempts to give Dalits a new start in the United States. And this is Pratibha today. She's come to America, and her life couldn't be more different from the one she left behind. She's learned how to drive and is living an independent American lifestyle. She has a one-bedroom apartment bigger than her home back in India, and she has a job as a psychotherapist, paying what would be an unimaginable fortune where she grew up.
I'm very fortunate because I got this opportunity to come here so I can help my people.
Here is Allentown, Pennsylvania, population 118,000. This historic American town with its old churches, iron factories, and breweries may seem like an unlikely backdrop in the fight for Dalit equality, but for Pratibha, that's exactly what it has become. And here, in the cultural melting pot of America, she's experiencing freedoms she's never known.
This country has freedom of speech. Like what you think, everybody has to respect that. In India, we don't have.
For Pratibha, the last 4 years have been all about proving herself and setting an example for her people. With a master's degree in social work from her home country, Pratibha works 6 days a week at this community mental health center, doing individual and group therapy.
Here I'm working with mental health issues. Those people have depression, bipolar, anxiety.
She's thriving at work and believes the example she's setting is improving the lives of her family back home.
My elder sister who dropped her education, like she just educated 8th grade, but like I gave her motivation to know she needs to learn. So now she started her education. And my youngest sister, she done her master's.
Every month she sends money to her family, so her mother no longer has to clean the houses of the upper caste. And Pratibha says her success in America has given her community a new sense of what's possible.
Before, like we had male-dominant society. Like everyone wants boy baby, nobody wants girl baby. But now, like I am the one example represented to them. So they like because of her, her mom is at home. Her sister is doing well, so like she is a main role model for her house. So like everybody is saying now, like let give the education to girl, don't discriminate to anyone.
But being a role model far from home isn't easy. Pratibha says she sometimes feels isolated. Back in India, her village was lively, and neighbors' doors were always left open for visitors. But here, she says, the streets feel empty and unfriendly. And even though she's in America, when she meets other Indians, the shadow of the caste system is still present.
You will meet higher caste people, they will say, what is your name? And if I say, my name is Pratibha, oh, but what is your last name? Even though like they are in United States, they spend their whole life here, but still their mind is discriminated, still their mind has that upper and lower caste.
When we first met Pratibha in India, she was one of the few young women in her village who wasn't married, something her mother continued to remind her of when she moved to the United States.
My mom is saying, now no more. You have to get married because like all people are asking us, when she is getting married, she is getting older and older.
Pratibha's mother can rest easy now. After putting marriage on the back burner, Pratibha found what she says is her perfect match, 8,000 miles from home.
So I got someone who can understand me, and he has same background and same education. We got married last year.
Vikas Kaire is one of the Dalits who came over with Pratibha in 2008. And like Pratibha, he is dedicated to the Dalit struggle. Last year they flew back to India, where 500 friends and family members gathered to celebrate their marriage and see the Dalits who made it to America. Now back in Allentown, they are trying to adapt to American culture, all except for the food.
I cooked Indian food, like different vegetables, Indian vegetables, green vegetables, and chapati, rice. We feel like we are in India when we eat this food, because all the time we can't eat American food, or not only sandwiches or not.
While many newlyweds might be thinking about starting a family, Pratibha and Vikas are putting their personal plans on hold. Their priority now is to set an example for other Dalits by building their careers and succeeding in the U.S.
When you will get children, we will be like all the time engaged with the children, and we forgot what we have to do. So we want to first settle our families, and first we can see what we can do for our community before we will have children.
Pratibha and her husband told us that eventually they hope to return home to India, but first they want to establish themselves financially in the United States. Their goal is to one day help pay for the education of the poorest Dalits, those who are destined for lives of hardship and degradation because of the caste into which they were born. When we come back, we'll give you a look at the issue of forced marriage and violence in immigrant communities. That story is straight ahead. Earlier this year, we traveled to England to uncover the heartbreaking stories of young women who are forced into a life of repression by being married off against their will. It's a custom that is spread across several of Britain's immigrant communities, a tradition that can lead to physical and emotional violence, and in the very worst of cases, even murder. This is the England of glossy travel books, the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, the dreaming spires of Oxford. It's the England of Jane Austen novels and costume dramas. But there are working-class cities like Blackburn that have never been on tourist itineraries. These were the old factory and mining towns that once made England the leading industrial nation in the world and helped fuel a global empire. Those days are over. Cities and towns across England have undergone a radical change as immigrants from Britain's former colonies have flocked to the United Kingdom itself to live, work, and raise their families. Their children are often caught between the customs of the old country and the freedoms of modern Britain.
My family came over from India to England in the 1960s, and basically they came over for work. And sadly, they didn't leave their beliefs and values at Heathrow Airport.
Bal Howard grew up in a tight-knit Sikh community in the north of England, surrounded by other families who had immigrated from India. But as she would find out, being born and bred in England didn't necessarily guarantee she'd have the same independence as other British women, especially when it came to marriage.
I always believed I was going to have an arranged marriage and always had the opportunity to say yes or no. And then my family introduced me to the man who was going to be my future husband. But I thought I'd have a choice right up until the last minute. I met him for half an hour with the family around me, and they said I had to go through with it. But I didn't feel any physical chemistry or attraction or anything like that. And I said no, but my father said to me, if you think about running away, I'll find you, and I'd rather kill you and go to prison than you dishonour the family.
It seems unbelievable that a father anywhere in the world would say something like that, but it's happening here, in families that seem to be living modern lives in a modern nation. And it happens because some communities hold on to their ancient traditions in which women are viewed as property. It is based on an unwritten code of honor, as some call it. For a woman to disgrace her family simply by going against its wishes is the ultimate sin. For Bal, it was this culture of honor that convinced her she had no choice but to get married. And it was the same culture of honor that made her stay in the marriage, even when her husband turned abusive.
What followed was 8.5 years of emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and I didn't want to be with him, but every time I went home to the family for help, they'd said to me to go back to him and make it work forever, ever, because it was your duty as a daughter to make it work, marriage is for life kind of thing.
The violence Bal experienced was only made worse because, she says, her parents were colluding in the crime, forcing her back into an abusive relationship. This pressure from families can be so intense that some in Bal's position ultimately end their own lives. In fact, a 2008 study found that young South Asian women in the UK were almost 3 times more likely to commit suicide than their white counterparts.
I thought, I don't want to kill myself, because that thought had often gone through my mind. I said, I actually want to live, and I've got to get out of here, and nobody's going to help me, so I'm on my own. Morning, would it be possible to book a taxi?
Bal is now happily remarried with a new life, but she says once you decide to flee, you become an outcast from your own community, and the persecution often doesn't stop there. As we reported this story across Great Britain, we found other women from immigrant communities who had fled their families, but still lived in terror. This woman, whom we'll call Maya, is living with her 2 sons in a government-funded shelter under a new identity.
The marriage that my parents forced me into was a sham. I had to force myself to do a lot of things in the marriage that I'd never ever do.
She says she was repeatedly raped and beaten by the Indian man her parents made her marry. But when she fled, she soon realized it wasn't just her husband who was coming after her.
I was receiving a lot of calls from both sides of the family, a lot of calls asking me to go back, a lot of calls bribing me to go back, a lot of emotional blackmail, but I had to stand my ground.
Oftentimes, that's not so easy. British law enforcement told us there are networks of informants across the country, and South Asian strangers in a new city will rarely pass unnoticed. Taxi drivers, moonlighting as bounty hunters, are sometimes used by families to hunt down runaway women like Maya. Maya's ex-husband has already tracked her down 4 times. Each time, Maya kept moving. A new city, a new name. We agreed to protect her identity and to avoid disclosing her current location out of concern for her safety.
My biggest worries are of being found out, probably of the boys being taken away from me, but having settled down here in this beautiful place, I'm beginning to see a hope for myself in the future.
there is evidence to suggest that cases like Maya's are hardly rare, and that the problem is not limited to a particular religion or country of origin. From London's Indian Sikh neighborhood of Southall to the large Pakistani Muslim community in the small northern city of Blackburn, old cultural practices do not seem to be fading, even within families who have been in England for generations. A government-commissioned study in 2008 was used by politicians to suggest that there could be as many as 4,000 forced marriages in Britain each year.
There is something fundamentally wrong here in Britain, where in 21st century Britain, we are still dealing with the barbaric practice of forced marriage. These are British-born subjects. I thought Britain stood for democracy, independence, and all those things. You know, we're not talking about some third world country out there. This is England.
Jasvinder Sangara runs a charity call center that offers advice on avoiding forced marriages or escaping abusive family relationships. The mostly volunteer team here at Karma Nirvana fielded more than 4,800 calls in 2010. The callers here are often young and desperate women. Most are British citizens. The collection of clippings Jasvinder displays here is a constant reminder of the real danger of forced marriage faced by some children. Parents might even take them overseas to marry foreign men eager for British visas. In the callers' voices, Jasvinder often hears a version of her own story.
I myself am a survivor of a forced marriage. I was born here in England. I don't know any other country bar England. This is home. I've never been to India. That's an alien country to me. I'm a British-born subject. I went to school here. But when I was at school here in the UK, I watched the majority of my sisters being taken out of British schools when they were 15 years old to marry strangers they had only ever met in photographs. They would disappear to the Punjab of India, come back as somebody's wife and daughter-in-law, and nobody in school blinked an eyelid and nobody asked any questions about their absence. When it was my turn, I was 14 and my mother presented me with a photograph of the man she told me I was promised to when I was 8 years old. And this is the first I've heard of it. But I also knew it was highly probable because I'd watched it happen to my sisters. I said no. I'm not marrying this man, Mum. I want to go to school, I want to get an education, and dare I say, even go to college or university. My family took me out of school when I was 15 years old, and I remember as clear as day my father walking me up to my bedroom, putting a lock on the door, and being held a prisoner in that room for weeks on end and not being allowed to leave the room until I agreed to the marriage.
Eventually, Jasvinder consented to the marriage, but as soon as she was let out of her room, she fled. When she called her mother, pleading to return, the response was devastating.
She said, from this day forward, you have two choices. You either come home and marry the man we've promised you to, because you will not dishonor this family, or from this day forward, you are now dead in our eyes. And that's a picture of me when I was, how old was I there? 9 years old. And I'd already been promised to somebody in marriage in that picture. And that's my younger sister, who's a year and a half younger than me, and she was forced to marry the man that I was promised to. That was the only way my family could claim some of the honour back.
The ultimate tragedy that led Jasvinder to begin speaking out as an author and activist was the 1993 suicide of another of her sisters, Rabina.
She suffered horrific violence in her marriage, went to my family for support, and they sent her back to the perpetrator saying it was her duty to make this marriage work for the sake of the family's honour. And in the end, my sister Rabina was 24 years old, and she set herself on fire, and she died of over 98% burns, and she just died. For whose honour?
This so-called honor violence can take many forms: emotional coercion, imprisonment, rape, and at its most extreme, it can lead to what are known as honor killings, where a family member will end a woman's life under the guise of protecting the family or the community's reputation. We met Detective Neil Hunter, who has seen firsthand the tragic consequences of honor gone awry.
the circumstances around the level of violence and the frenzied nature of some of the attacks is really quite upsetting.
Detective Superintendent Hunter took us on a tour of murder sites in the northern English county of Lancashire. The relatively quiet communities here have witnessed roughly a dozen honor-related killings in the last 6 years. Hunter has been a detective here for decades, but hasn't seen anything like these crimes before.
He left to get and arm himself with 2 knives that he put down the waistband of his trousers, walked up the road here, brutally murdered his estranged wife, and then he disappeared via the train station to London and then eventually to Glasgow.
First stop was the house of Nazia Ahmed, whose estranged husband Zamir stabbed her to death when her success made him jealous.
Zamir Ahmed refused to accept that his estranged wife wanted her own independent life and took the law into his own hands.
Just a few miles away, Hunter pointed out the house where a husband burned his own wife and 4 young daughters to death because they'd become too westernized.
There was 5 bodies on the floor, on the road, in the street, covered with tarpaulin, with the most horrific burn and smoke injuries that you could ever imagine.
Roughly a quarter of all recent murders here in eastern Lancashire have been honor killings like these. But despite this shocking number, it has taken a while for UK authorities to understand what is happening in their immigrant communities. And some British law enforcement officials agree that understanding these killings, rapes, assaults, and kidnappings as unique forms of crime is essential to combating the problem.
We are talking about thousands of women at risk in this country from people who claim to love them the most, their own families.
Nazir Afzal, who was born into Britain's Pakistani community, is a director of the Government Prosecution Service and the point man on honor killings.
The biggest obstacle I think we have faced is the lack of awareness, people thinking that it wasn't happening. And that is allied with this wall of silence within communities. Communities, particularly males in communities, don't talk about this issue. They would rather focus on anything else, quite frankly, than talk about what's happening to their own women and to their daughters and to their sisters. About 7 years ago, I decided that this was an area that wasn't being talked about, that men certainly weren't talking about it. So I organised a national conference which had lots of international coverage, and then realised that it needed a great deal more awareness.
Afzal initiated a review process that examined around 120 cases of disappearances and apparent suicides over the past decade. Afzal subsequently reclassified 1/6 of these as honor killings and saw recurrent themes in each.
It's about the one woman being pressured by several members of her family, by dozens of members of her community, and in worst cases, suffering significant harm. So this is not about honor. This is not about a faith or ideology. This is all about women being controlled by men, and men being so weak that the only way they can control them is by harming them.
But Mal Howard, who herself left a forced marriage after years of abuse and now works with local police, says the key is getting the message of support to those young women fearing for their lives.
I wanted somebody to help me, but I didn't know how to ask for help because I was taught from my family not to integrate with Western society. Don't tell them anything that goes on within these four walls. They won't understand. You're different from the other girls. You know, you're not an English girl. English girls are dirty. They have boyfriends. You're not allowed to have that kind of thing. So internally I was screaming for help. And I think if somebody had said, come here, I can help you, I'd have sat down with somebody and voiced those inner concerns that I had.
In 2007, the British Parliament passed the Forced Marriage Act, which permits young people to take out injunctions against their own parents if they can prove that they are at risk of being forced into a marriage. There's also a forced marriage unit trained to extract girls sent abroad for forced marriage or to protect those who are in the country. When we looked at this story again, we couldn't help but wonder if this problem only happens in the United Kingdom's immigrant communities. So when we come back, we'll give you a look at how forced marriage has reached this side, our side of the Atlantic. So stay here with us. Once again, welcome back. The United States is a country of immigrants. Last year alone, over 1 million people became permanent residents and over 6,000 became naturalized citizens. Today, an estimated 12% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. So it doesn't seem too far-fetched to think that forced marriage might be happening right here under our noses. But unlike the United Kingdom, we have no official figures to tell us how widespread the problem is, and no way to address it through our existing laws and policies.
It's disturbing that we have yet to really focus on the issue here in the United States. And there's tremendous need to better study it, to better understand it, to have community dialogue and collaboration, and to react and try to help the women and girls who are courageous enough to seek protection.
Layli Miller-Muro has been protecting immigrant women since she was a young attorney. She is the executive director of the Tahari Justice Center in Falls Church, Virginia. That's an organization that provides legal and social services for immigrant women who are fleeing violence. And increasingly, that has meant forced marriage.
We were getting calls from law enforcement, from congressional offices, government agencies, social service providers, school counselors, and a wide range of community members who were calling us from around the country, from unlikely places like Iowa and Tennessee and Texas, who were all being faced with forced marriage cases, didn't know what to do, called us to ask what the legal remedies might be available. And we were stunned by how few resources there really are.
So, in the spring of 2011, Miller-Muro launched a national survey in order to understand the scope and the severity of the issue in the United States.
70% of our respondents said that they believe that there are forced marriage cases that they haven't concretely identified that are out there. 10% of our survey respondents don't even have a working definition of forced marriage within their organization, so they're not actively looking for these cases.
She sent the survey to legal and social service providers, community leaders, educators, and law enforcement officers, all groups likely to come across cases of forced marriage. And she wasn't prepared for what she heard.
What we've learned so far in the study is staggering. We've learned that there are as many as 1,200 known forced marriage cases currently in the United States, coming from 42 states throughout the United States, from immigrant communities representing 48 countries. That we know already.
As we saw in the United Kingdom, South Asian communities have an especially high rate of forced marriage. But preliminary results of Miller-Muro's survey suggest that here in the United States, the problem affects many other immigrant groups as well.
They also include the African community, the Middle Eastern community, the Eastern European community, the Southern former Soviet Republic communities, and the Latin American communities. So this is not a problem, although you might find trends and predominance in certain communities. It is not one from which other immigrant communities are immune.
And that's true of neighborhoods like this one in New York City, full of immigrants from all over Africa. Here, old cultural habits remain strong, including forced marriage, which can often lead to clashes between parents holding on to traditional values and children raised amidst American freedoms. Zainab Yega's specialty is easing those tensions. She's an activist who founded an organization to help girls and women in the African immigrant community who are dealing with domestic issues, including forced marriage.
It's coercion, a long process of coercion. So it's not like, the biological parents decide all of a sudden, okay, you're going to get married to this person, and if you don't, there will be consequences. No, it is for the young girl, everyone within the family talking to her about the need to get married, and consistently. So it's the subtle and nuanced pressure that she comes under to the extent where, and then she just kind of, her resistance just kind of breaks down, and then she, agrees to get married. So that's a lot what we see.
But Ayega says it's also important to understand that these kinds of marriages are arranged with what the girl's parents believe are the best intentions. In truth, the parents often use forced marriage as a way of protecting their daughters from what they perceive to be the dangers of American society.
It seems so permissive There's nothing private, there's nothing sacred, there's nothing that seems to be respected. And so for some parents, that's very scary. So it's easier to say, I feel safe knowing that she's married, she's in someone's home, and, that is the only safety I can guarantee her. But in that equation misses what the girl wants.
Back in Virginia, Miller Muro says she hopes the results of her survey will help convince lawmakers in the U.S. to take the issue of forced marriage as seriously as their British counterparts.
If there's one thing that we're learning through the work that we're doing, and if there's one thing that I do hope the public and other organizations, law enforcement and lawmakers learn about this issue, is that we are just hitting the tip of the iceberg, and that it is a huge problem that people don't want to talk about, but is severe and limits the life of women and girls throughout the United States. To be forced into a marriage is to be forced into a situation where you will be raped, where you may suffer domestic violence, and where you otherwise are likely to live a life of subjugation. And so this is an important issue that we need to care about as a community.
The survey on forced marriage closed on August 5th, and the center is hoping to release a report on the findings by the end of September. We'll keep you posted on our website and Facebook page when the results come through. And that's our program for tonight. From New York, for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night. If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.